Good afternoon, and welcome to the final lecture in the full lecture series in the Information Ecology. Our final speaker is Professor William Fisher from Harvard Law School. Professor Fisher is the Hale and Dorr Professor of Intellectual Property at Harvard and also the Director of the Berkman Center. And he is the author of a forthcoming book called Promises to Keep, from which some of the ideas that he is discussing today are drawn, and a chapter of that book is linked to from our website for those of you who are interested, and which develops in some detail some of the ideas he's going to discuss here today. Professor Fisher, who rather mysteriously goes by the name of Terry some of the time, but is known professionally as William Fisher, just for those of you who are puzzled by the multiple appellations you'll hear from his colleagues today in questions, is someone who I admire enormously in the world of intellectual property scholarship and as a legal scholar generally. He has a set of skills, any one of which would be remarkable, but collectively are really unique. He's an extraordinarily fine legal historian, and since law is an institution which develops through history, that's an absolutely vital perspective to bring. And his work on the history of property is really the best of its kind, in my view, in American law. He has an extremely fine-honed grasp of economics, the economics of law and the relationship between law and economics, and a superb toolkit in terms of the economic analysis of law. And yet he's not prone to the somewhat distressing reductionism, blindness, and circularity which many of the protagonists of that theory occasionally resort to. In fact, it's the combination of the legal economic and the deep historical work that really marks his scholarship. And those two by themselves would be quite remarkable because they're very unusual to find paired. But he's also interested in actually making things work, which is not a requirement for academics, as you may have noticed. And it's really this sort of the trifecta that I think marks his scholarship, and in particular marks the project which we're lucky enough to have him present to us today. Terry Fisher.
That was a very gracious introduction. Its only disadvantage is that it's going to be hard to live up to in the next 45 minutes. But I'll try. So as Jamie indicated, the topic I'll be discussing today is developed at a good deal more length in a book that's in draft now. As it happens, I have to submit to the publisher the final version of the manuscript at the end of December. So I'm now in the throes of revising it. So it means that I am eager to hear comments, suggestions. One of the reasons why I'm happy to give presentations like this is to get responses from people like you. So a little more specifically, ways of adjusting or improving the argument would be most welcome. Denunciations of its fundamental character are less welcome at this juncture, but suggestions would be great. So the title for the talk is An Alternative Compensation System for the Entertainment Industry. And I'm going to be spending about half an hour on that issue. But I'm going to spend, before then, about 15 minutes setting that argument into context. And that's going to entail reviewing the other components of the book fast. So the book addresses the crisis in the entertainment industry. As all of you are undoubtedly familiar. The music industry has been in an economic and increasing cultural crisis since 1999. Its revenues have been falling at an accelerating pace for some reasons we'll talk about, but they're not going to be terribly surprising. The film industry thus far has not been hit. In fact, its revenues, both domestic and international, continue to rise. but as the size of broadband connections increase, the size of hard drives increase, compression, decompression systems improve, the film industry is going to experience the same crisis. So those are the two components of the entertainment industry that the book concentrates on, music and film. Other kinds of entertainment works, like e-books, for example, and possibly, although these are slightly different, games, could be folded in this analysis. But to keep things relatively manageable, I'm concentrating here exclusively on music and film. So the first half of the book is diagnostic. It makes an effort to describe how we got to where we are. The second half of the book is prescriptive or normative. It offers three alternative combinations of legal reforms and business models that might enable us to extricate ourselves from the crisis. So chapter 1 is the foundation of the analysis. It describes first the technologies that have transformed in the last decade the ways in which we gain access to recorded entertainment, including digital storage and recording systems, compression, decompression systems, of which the most well-known is MP3, and of course the spread of the internet. So I'm hitting the high points here. If you want to come back to the details on any one of these issues, we can be happy to do so in the question and answer period. Those technologies have made possible three new mechanisms, ways of gaining access to entertainment: downloading, interactive streaming, and non-interactive streaming. I'm going to assume everybody here is familiar with those, given, among other things, your age group. If not, we'd have to come back, happy to come back to them. All right, now this requires a little bit more explanation. The new technologies offer enormous benefits, economic and cultural benefits. So one of the reasons for paying attention to this field is the magnitude of the possibilities latent in this seemingly technical adjustment. So a little bit more specifically, large cost savings are made possible in this zone. They're most easily seen in the music industry, but similar things can be observed in the film industry. So here's how in the United States currently the suggested retail price of a typical CD is distributed. That suggested retail price, with the exception of Universal, maybe temporarily, is about $18. It's distributed approximately 38% to the retailer, 8% to the distributor. All the green zones here are going to be record company shares. Overhead, artist and repertory, marketing, manufacturing, and then a reported small slice for profit. The yellow zones are distributed to the artist nominally. So 12% goes to the recording artist, 4% goes to the music publisher. Those correspond to the 2 copyrights in every sound recording. But from the share that goes to the recording artist are deducted things like production, packaging, free goods, breakage, reserves, recording costs, promotion, half the cost of preparing music videos, and so forth. So typically, instead of 12%, the recording artist will get between 0 and 8, depending on his or her market power. So against this backdrop, the new technologies offer quite dramatic cost savings. Distribution of unencrypted copies of sound recordings over the internet potentially enable us to eliminate retailers and to eliminate manufacturers, because there are no physical objects, no CDs in the typical case, that have to be distributed. In addition, there are other cost savings that are possible elsewhere in the scheme, but they're a little bit trickier to identify. To see them, you have to first review the various functions that record companies currently perform. I'm going through this quite quickly. Again, if you want to come back to it, we will. And notice that in 4 of these 5 functions, the new technologies offer significant cost savings. So returning to our distribution chart here, additional cost savings are available in this sector, this one, and this one, making possible increased revenues for artists, decreased prices for consumers, or both. Well, that's the biggest, or at least most easily seen, of the potential gains, but it's not the only one. So, in addition, the new technologies enable us to eliminate overproduction and underproduction of entertainment products because they're all created on demand. It significantly increases the precision with which entertainment products are delivered to consumers because they can be obtained instantaneously. You can get individual songs, not entire CD collections with their usual extra baggage. You can engage in sampling to decide what you want to listen to in advance. And in the ideal scenario, one would have access through currently available technologies to what Paul Goldstein and subsequently Orrin Hatch referred to as a celestial jukebox, in which every person at any time could gain access to any piece of music or film ever recorded. Fourth, the new technologies dramatically increase the number and variety of musicians, or in the film area, filmmakers, who can make their works available to a global audience because it reduces distribution costs dramatically and increases one's ability to reach niche markets. That increased range on the part of producers, in turn, sustains greater cultural diversity. So if you go, for example, to live365.com, which is an aggregation site for webcasters, you'll find an extraordinary array of musical offerings compared, say, to the varieties that are available on your radio using traditional over-the-airwaves radio distribution. So here are a few examples. The Makossa Jukebox, offering 100% Cameroonian ethnic music. Paradise Sahimian. Radio Free Boonie, very useful for people with young children. Over 800 jazz stations, over 1,000 folk stations, 1,500 rock stations, which, as one might imagine, given the numbers, are much more specialized than are available in the traditional formats. Why is this a good thing? Well, the economic way of capturing the advantage here is to say that greater diversity enables more precise satisfaction of consumers' tastes. A less economic phrasing of the same point, using the language of John Stuart Mill, is that the greater the diversity of entertainment products available to us, the more we are stimulated to exercise all of our faculties, and the more the culture as a whole becomes rich, diversified, and animating. And that leads us to the last, and in my view, most important of the potential benefits of the new technologies. Goes under the heading of semiotic democracy, not a phrase I invented. Refers to the broad phenomenon that during the late 19th and early 20th century, most Western cultures, certainly including the United States, have experienced greater and greater concentration in the power of making cultural meanings in fewer and fewer record companies, movie studios, advertising houses, and political consultants. The internet notoriously offers the opportunity for reversing this concentration of semiotic power. In the entertainment context, the way in which that potential reversal is most manifested is by blurring the boundary, the traditional boundary between producers and consumers, enabling people we used to think of as passive recipients of entertainment products to rework them in novel forms, exemplified by the rapidly growing edited versions of the Star Wars films, a similar collage of Batman movies, and then various services, some of them software-based, some of them hardware-based, that enable one to edit, transform movies that come to you. One of the most interesting, not yet on the market, is GoToIt TV. Uses a combination of hardware, software, and metadata to enable you to adjust on the fly the content of movies obtained through either DVD format or through a digital cable service. More specifically, provides you 3 virtual knobs, continuous range, corresponding to sex, violence, and language. So 0 to 10 on each of these. And then the movie will play to you with the appropriate scenes deleted. Coming soon will be, be able to dial it up, I think. But for the time being, it's just dial it down. Okay, those are the potential benefits. And I dwell on these because they're critical to the analysis as a whole. Why do we care about all this? Well, we care about it primarily because these technologies are potentially so revolutionary in a good sense. But it's also the case that they have substantial dangers. And here, these are more obvious. I'm going to move through them more quickly. The new technologies threaten the revenues of creators by depriving them of their traditional markets. They threaten moral rights by corroding the ability of artists to control the content of their creations once released to the world. Initially, when these edited phenomena became common, some of the relevant directors and producers were enthusiastic. So George Lucas comments on the Phantom Edit, "The internet is a new medium. It's all about doing things like that." More recently, the tone has changed, exemplified by Steven Spielberg's response to an analogous disrespectful edit of one of his films. "No one is authorized to impose their truth on top of ours, no matter how strongly they may disagree with it." Okay, so depending on what you think of moral rights and their corrosion, you may be worried about this. You also may be worried in this new environment about the blurring of cultural reference points, the instability of the artifacts that we hear and watch, making conversation and parody more difficult. All right, that's what chapter 1 of the book is all about. It's setting the stage by describing the new technologies, their advantages and disadvantages. Now we're going to accelerate. So chapter 2 sets the groundwork for the legal analysis by describing the state of the music and film industries in 1990, which I think of as the baseline, when the technological revolution began in earnest, and exploring the merits and demerits of the systems in place at the time. Bottom line is they were working reasonably well, had some defects, but were working reasonably well. What went awry? Well, between 1990 and the present, we have witnessed, driven by the technological advances, 8 overlapping cycles of innovation and response. With respect to each of these cycles, technological innovations supported a business innovation that offered consumers a more convenient or pleasurable or flexible mode of accessing entertainment, had clear cultural advantages, but at the same time disrupted existing business models and provoked, not surprisingly then, a reaction. In some cases, that reaction took the form of litigation on the basis of existing copyright law. In some cases, it took the form of statutory reform. And in some cases, it took the form of technological self-help measures. But in each case, innovation, response, innovation, response. And those 8 cycles involved digital recorders in the late 1980s, encryption circumvention beginning in earnest in the early 1990s, the music locker systems in the mid-1990s, webcasting in the mid-1990s, centralized file sharing, that's Napster, Scour, and Aimster in the late 1990s, decentralized file sharing, GNU-Tella and improved GNU-Tella systems and fast-track systems in just around the turn of the century, CD burning, which continues to the present, and improved digital video recorders, replay systems. Each one of them ends with defeat of the innovation. So the net effects of these cycles, examined in considerable length in chapter 3, is unfortunate. We are left with a situation characterized by high transaction costs, including enormous litigation costs. The price to consumers of access to recorded entertainment remains high. We don't have a celestial jukebox. Encryption and ephemeral downloads continue to reduce the flexibility, curtail fair use, and impede semiotic democracy. The concentration of the entertainment industry, currently now 5 record companies control 83% of the domestic market and 7 studios control 90% of the domestic market, reduces consumers' choice. And after all this effort, the system is not working. Peer-to-peer copying systems continue to proliferate and threaten artists' revenues. Best current estimates are between 50 and 60 million Americans engage in unauthorized downloading of music, approximately the same numbers voted for President Bush in the last election. All right, so against that backdrop, the second half of the book, as I mentioned, considers 3 different combinations of legal reforms and new business models that would address these problems more specifically would enable us to reap some or more of the benefits while avoiding some or more of the harms. I'm going to present them in paradigms. They're presented in the book as paradigms. I'm going to present them here as paradigms, reasonably autonomous clusters, but you'll be able easily to imagine ways in which they could be combined. They're presented in order of increasing desirability and decreasing likelihood of being adopted. So here are the three. I'm going to summarize the first two fast, and then, as I say, spend the bulk of my time on the last one. So the first takes property rights seriously. First, accepts the controversial analogy long drawn by the intermediaries in the music and film industries between real property rights and intellectual property rights, and pursues it conscientiously. The theory that underlies this approach is that we should strive to clarify and enforce the property rights of creators and then employ Coasian bargains in the emergence of private collective rights societies to remove the transaction costs that otherwise would impede the distribution and usage of entertainment goods. To follow this method, one first needs to identify the kinds of protections that real property currently enjoys. Many of these things are fairly obvious. Some are a little less so. And then explore what analogous protections in the entertainment industry would entail. The bottom line, we now have a technological moment. Is that this system would offer a somewhat surprising array of advantages, but also some quite serious disadvantages. Among its benefits are, first, media companies, confident in their ability to make money in this new environment, would accelerate the presentation to the world of authorized distribution systems like iTunes, Napster 2, and so forth. You would simultaneously see the emergence of refined and flexible private licensing societies like ASCAP, BMI, and CSAC in the new environment that would indeed, as Robert Merges argues, overcome transaction cost barriers to licensing. Musicians would, in this new environment, increasingly be able to break free of the record companies because they would now have available to them business models enabling them to distribute their products directly to consumers. And you would see more refined pricing systems, which from an economic standpoint are advantageous in giving potential producers better signals about what consumers want. All significant advantages. The disadvantages, however, are first, that the record companies and studios may appropriate all of the cost savings made possible by the new technologies, as they have done in each previous technological revolution. Next, the price signals that would be provided in such a system are distorted by the fact they focus on objects, not consumption rates. The current system does that. In this respect, the property rights model would just replicate the defects of the existing regime, but it's unfortunate. In this world, critical and transformative uses of recordings would be curtailed, so semiotic democracy is sacrificed. The end-to-end principle on which the internet was first built would be corroded. Come back to that if you want. And price discrimination would be facilitated, a very complex subject, but on balance, disadvantageous. Number 5, chapter 5, explores the second of the two clusters of reforms. The theory here is quite different. It begins with an observation that certain industries in the American economy are regulated substantially more heavily than average. They include industries in the transportation field, communications, public utilities, residential leaseholds, a little more complicated, are all draped with restrictions on what providers can do, much more sharp than is true of other goods and services. those regulatory models have changed over time substantially. The chapter then explores why we regulate businesses of certain sorts much more heavily than others, and argues that those reasons, once brought to the surface, apply with the same force to the entertainment industry. And that in turn suggests we should amplify the regulations that already riddle the entertainment industry, build them systematically into what you would think of as an entertainment industry that would resemble telecommunications. So there are lots of complicated details here, but the basic idea is much more extensive government involvement in the management of the production and distribution of entertainment. Advantages. Internet distribution of recorded music and film would grow under this model. The diversity of services available to consumers would increase. The net revenues of the record industry would remain stable, not grow as they would in the property rights model. And composers and performers would get larger shares of revenue, taking the cue from Section 114 of the current copyright statute or analogous rules in the European system. Disadvantages, however, would include the hazards of price setting, which are always difficult. Transaction costs would remain high. This system would continue to have copy protection systems, which would limit semiotic democracy. And to run it, there would be necessary substantial degrees of surveillance and invasions of privacy. Okay, so that brings us to the zone on which I'm going to concentrate most of our time. This is the last of the proposals. In my view, in many respects, the most promising. But, as we'll see as we go through it, there are many sticking points, many difficulties that plague proposals of this sort. I'm going to identify some. Others may be obvious to you. And I'm hoping we can have a discussion about, in the spirit of how we could best go about minimizing these hazards. All right, here's the theory on which the argument is based. An argument familiar to economists. Entertainment products, like navigation aids and armies, are public goods in the sense that they share two characteristics, related characteristics. They're non-rivalrous, meaning the consumption of them by one person does not prevent another person from consuming them. And they're non-excludable. That exaggerates it slightly. They're hard to exclude. From them, it's hard to exclude second consumers. So once I make my poem available to Jamie, it's difficult to prevent him from making it available to Professor Rai. Those two circumstances in combination create a notorious danger that public goods of all sorts, including entertainment products, will be underproduced. Potential producers, recognizing their inability to recoup the cost of production, won't produce them. That state of affairs means that government has to get involved somehow. How? Well, over the course of the last couple of millennia, there have been 5 and only 5 mechanisms employed by governments to address the problem of public goods. They are, first, the government can supply the public good itself. For example, governments supply armies. They supply space research. Second, government can subsidize private production, pay people to produce these things, as the NEA did for the arts, as the NIH does currently for various forms of scientific and medical research. Third, the government can issue prizes to people after they have produced public goods. So as number 2 is pre-production subsidies, number 3 is post-production prizes. These systems have been advocated by and tried by people as diverse as James Madison, the governments of the Soviet Union and the People's Republic of China, and contemporary microeconomists like Stephen Chevelle. Fourth, government can protect producers of public goods against competition. For example, 19th century statutes in the United States granted private companies exclusive rights to construct and operate toll roads or bridges between certain cities or across certain rivers. Patents and copyrights fall into this fourth zone. the essence of a patent or copyright system is to prevent other people from competing with authors in the creation of embodiments of their ideas. And the fifth of the approaches is government can assist producers in increasing excludability, overriding one of the two conditions to define a public good. For example, trade secret laws that enhance one's ability to conceal the contents of one's Coke formula, or boat hull protection statutes that forbid a certain kind of easy reverse engineering of the shape of boats are designed to increase excludability. Since the late 18th century in the United States, entertainment products have been stimulated primarily by reliance on the fourth approach, copyright law. In the mid-1990s, as that mechanism began to break down, Congress in the United States, and the World Intellectual Property Organization internationally shifted increasingly towards strategy number 5, exemplified by the Digital Millennium Copyright Act, Section 1201. That, too, is proving ineffective. And so the foundation of the argument offered here is that we should reconsider our reliance on these two approaches, back up, and use this one. Okay, that's the fundamental idea. So how would it work? Well, there are lots of details here. I'll give you a few of them, concentrating on the issues that seem most controversial. In such a system, you'd first have a registration regime in which the owners of the copyrights in audio and video recordings would register them with the Copyright Office and receive in return unique registration numbers. Then you'd have to raise some money, a lot of money. Well, before discussing how, it's helpful to think about how much. Well, one might employ any of 4 criteria to decide how much money to raise to run the system. Some economists have suggested the appropriate criterion is to raise enough money to provide creators of entertainment products the full social surplus associated with their products. Means the total difference between the demand curve and supply curve, or more prosaically, the total amount the consumers would be willing to pay for access to entertainment products, plus the total profits the producers could make from supplying them. That may be attractive from the standpoint of a pure economic model, but it has some substantial disadvantages. Most importantly, it would be extraordinarily expensive and therefore politically unpalatable. There are some other difficulties with it, not worth going into here. The second possibility was suggested by some 19th century British reformers is fairness. We compensate the creators of entertainment to the extent that's fair. Although this has some moral attractions, it's a notoriously ambiguous criterion. I think too ambiguous to be worth pursuing in this context, although as we're going to see, the alternatives have ambiguities of their own. Okay, strategy 3, the red color is meant to flag issues that are sticking points. Special difficulty surrounds them. The third criterion, which is the dominant one that I'm suggesting we should organize such a system in the first couple of years, is make creators whole. We're not sure what the optimal level of compensation for the creators of entertainment would be, so for the time being, let's just use this system so as to keep the aggregate return to copyright owners stable, and then over time adjust it up or down so as to preserve a flourishing entertainment culture. That's the basic idea. All right, so now mechanics. These are very complicated but less intriguing, probably. 2, determine how much the creators of music and film would suffer as a result of being deprived of their copyrights. That's what we're going to end up doing here. You have to understand how music and film is created and marketed in the United States now. So here's a quick sketch. First, the music industry. A composer writes a song, typically assigns the copyright interest in the composition to a music publisher that then begins to raise money by licensing it. First to sheet music printers to make copies of the sheet music, and then through the Harry Fox Agency to record importers movie studios, those are sync licenses, and most importantly, through mechanical licenses issued to record companies. The record companies need two inputs to make their products. They need both these mechanical licenses, and they need performers to actually make the music, and so they approach recording artists and get them to make the music and to assign their sound recording copyrights to the record companies. So the color scheme here, if it's not obvious already, is the blue are the actual artists, the creators. The red are the assignees of the copyrights. The yellow are the intermediaries, and the purple are the licensees. So this isn't the end of the story yet. The publisher then also issues performance licenses through 3 collective rights societies to such organizations as radio and TV stations, restaurants, and webcasters. Now, a recent complication in this scheme is that webcasters, unlike radio stations, have to obtain licenses through a complicated mechanism from the record companies. Radio stations, when they broadcast music, have to pay the owners of the copyrights through this channel here in the compositions. But they don't have to pay the owners of the copyrights here in the sound recordings. Webcasters do. And the agency that negotiates those licenses is Sound Exchange. So against this backdrop, here's how money flows in the system. Not surprisingly, it flows through the channels cut by the legal rights backwards, with one important exception, which is this. The record companies currently pay approximately $100 million a year to the radio and TV stations to induce them to broadcast recordings that will then be purchased by the ultimate consumers. Okay, so our goal now is to identify which of these streams will be corroded by how much if we suspend copyright law as to internet distribution of sound recordings and non-commercial reproduction of sound recordings. So these are the revenue streams that would be threatened. In a minute, we'll talk about how much. Okay, movies. How are movies produced? The legal rights here are actually simpler than they are in the music industry, but the players in the movie industry are more complicated. So you have a bunch of contributors to a movie. Typically, a producer aggregates all of these rights. Rights from the novelist, rights from screenwriters, from actors, directors, composers, location owners, record companies, and music publishers. All these rights of different sorts are consolidated in the hands of a producer who enters into, at some point in this process, a distribution agreement, typically a perpetual worldwide distribution agreement with a studio that then begins to, as in the previous example, license the finished product to theaters, HBO, pay-per-view, airlines, TV networks, video stores, which was once thought to be the death of the movie industry, has turned out to be its salvation. Cable companies, record companies, merchandise manufacturers, and advertisers. Again, money flows through the system backwards, through the channels cut by the legal rights. Which of these revenue streams would be corroded by the suspension of copyright law? It's these. So, the numbers, for those of you curious about it, there's about 20 pages of the chapter that make an effort to estimate these numbers, are as follows. In a baseline year of 2000, for which we have reasonably good data, the total adverse impact on the music industry of suspending copyright law for internet distribution and non-commercial reproduction of sound recordings would be $1.24 billion. For the film industry, it would be $532 million, for a total of $1.7 billion. Assuming an administrative agency devotes 20% of its revenues to administrative costs, that's a little bit generous, figuring that a government agency is going to be less efficient than a private organization. That increases the necessary total to $2.2 billion. Adjusting it to 2004 figures using the Consumer Price Index, we get $2.4 billion that would be necessary each year to run such a system. That's compared with the current revenues of the music industry alone of approximately $10.5 billion. Okay, $2.4 billion is a lot of money. Where would we get it? Well, there are two possibilities. The first one is an income tax. This would be the simplest, and from various economic standpoints, the best. The advantages of using an income tax is very low administrative costs and relatively low distortionary effects on consumers' behavior. Now, that's a complicated subject, but I'll just note it. If you want to come back to it, I'd be happy to. Unfortunately, an increase in the administrative costs has one major disadvantage, is it would be politically unpopular. My tax dollars are paying for smut, misogyny, and so forth. I don't listen to music or watch movies. Why should I have to pay for them? Objections of this sort, for which there are ready rebuttals in the economics literature, nevertheless would be politically powerful. So, most likely for the immediate future, an income tax, despite its advantages and despite the modest size of the tax, is probably infeasible. Modest size, currently the average American household spends $450 a year on access to recorded entertainment. That's CDs, purchases of DVDs and videotapes, rentals of DVDs and videotapes, pay-per-view or premium cable channels, and so forth. It's about $450 a year. The income tax to run the system in the first year, an important reservation, would be $32 per household. So a huge cost savings. Nevertheless, despite that advantage, its political status would be quite questionable, suggesting that for the immediate future, one would have to rely not on an income tax, but a tax on goods and services, specifically the devices and services that enable one to gain access to and enjoy the recorded entertainment that would now be for free. Okay, so the advantages of this system would, as you might expect, mirror the advantages and disadvantages of an income tax. It's more politically acceptable, but would also result in substantially more distortions of consumer behavior. For example, half of the 2 billion blank CDs sold in the United States each year are used for recording music, and half are used, roughly speaking, for backing up data. Pause on that statistic for a moment. There are more blank CDs sold in the United States per year than there are pre-recorded CDs sold in the United States, suggesting the scale of the copying going on now. Now, return to the main point. Because only half of the blank CDs are used for music and the other half are used for data, imposition of a significant tax on them will result in distortion. Those people who use it to back up their data, some will be deterred by an 8 cents per disk tax and won't back up their data. So it's a disadvantage, but to be clear, even concentrating our attention on devices and services, the tax rate would not be too formidable. 15% in 2004. Bringing that down to real numbers here. A broadband subscription currently costs approximately $30 a month, varies slightly between DSL and cable systems, so it's about $30 a month. Under this regime, you'd pay $34.50 a month, $4.50 increase, and get in return unlimited access to recorded entertainment. Now, I'm going to note one variation on this theme for those of you who might want to pursue this. The distortionary effects of a tax on goods and services, something definitely to worry about, could be ameliorated, but with cost of its own, if we engaged in Ramsey pricing. So if there are economists in the room who want to talk about this, I'd be happy to come back to it. Okay, so we've talked about the registration system, the amount of money we'd need to raise, the taxation system. Now, the last of the critical mechanical questions. Where's the money go? How do we distribute it? Well, the basic principle here is we want to estimate the relative value of each entertainment product to consumers and to compensate creators in proportion to their ability to please consumers. Why? Why is that the right criterion? Well, from an economic standpoint, it's that criterion that provides the right signals to potential creators to create the kinds of things that people value. From a fairness standpoint, it corresponds to what social psychologists refer to as equity theory, the proposition to which most Americans and Western Europeans subscribe that the fruits of a collective enterprise, whether it's a factory an industry or a society should be distributed to its contributors in proportion to their contributions. If you contribute a lot, you get paid a lot. If you contribute a little, you get paid a little. Finally, pursuit of this criterion, basic idea here is consumer sovereignty, would minimize the hazard of governmental determination of the merits of works. Always a bad idea. Okay, so that's our goal. How are we going to accomplish it? Well, here's where things get a little sticky. The starting point, baseline, the primary device is going to be to count consumption. Our aspiration should be to estimate, you don't need a comprehensive count, to estimate the frequency with which each song is listened to or each movie is watched. Now, with respect to streaming, that's relatively easy. Non-interactive webcasters would report their playlist and the numbers of subscribers, and interactive webcasters would report the number of streams. As streaming becomes the dominant way in which entertainment is distributed, which it is, this problem becomes ever easier because of the ease of counting streams. But streaming is not yet the dominant mechanism. CD burning is still common. How do you count consumption for CD burning? Here you need sales data on CDs and surveys to determine how frequently particular genres are copied and then replayed. The hardest of the counting problem arises vis-a-vis downloads. So people who work about alternative compensation systems worry over this issue more than any other. The problem arises because just counting downloads themselves is a poor indicator of consumption rates. Why is it a poor indicator? Well, first because lots of consumers download music that they then discard. This is especially common now when music is free. Second, it's problematic because consumers play back downloaded music at very different frequency rates, which are missed if you just count the downloads. And finally, counting downloads is vulnerable to ballot stuffing, the temptation now of artists, not consumers, to game the system by exaggerating the frequency with which their products are being consumed. Those are the three problems. How to solve them? Well, the most promising, not perfect, of the potential solutions is sampling, in which one would persuade a large number of sampled households selected at random to be willing to allow their consumption choices to be tracked automatically by software plugins distributed along with their peer-to-peer systems, generating data which is aggregated before a person sees it so as to protect the privacy of the individual consumers, that would then enable the Copyright Office to estimate the relative popularity of each work. So in the background here, the system that's used both as a model and as an exemplar of dangers to be avoided is the Nielsen and Arbitron systems, which have their merits and demerits. Okay, so that's counting consumption. A good guide, not perfect, to the value consumers place on digital recordings. Can we do any better? Well, yes. One thing we can do is to refine the consumption data with duration. Longer works are worth more to consumers than shorter works, and the counts should be adjusted accordingly. Now, another possibility, however, just counting consumption and even adjusting consumption counts for duration will miss intensity of pleasure. Ordinarily now, when one leaves a movie, you don't tip the studio if you thought it was great or ask for a rebate if you thought it was bad. So the current system doesn't give consumers an effective mechanism for signaling to creators their intensity of pleasure. But just because the current system doesn't mean we should be satisfied with that. And so, again, a group of scholars and activists who work in this field have suggested a way of addressing the intensity issue. How? Well, by voting, by asking consumers to express their preferences. Now, this is an intriguing suggestion because it shifts away from the principle of consumer sovereignty latent in the current market system and preserved so far in the model I've outlined, in favor of what looks more like a political system. Has advantages, but also has substantial disadvantages. It's hard to get people to vote. There's an enhanced risk of ballot stuffing here. The votes might go to places we would be unhappy about, like reinforcing the current bias of the entertainment industry toward physically attractive performers. It might go to political causes. Eugene Volokh, for example, suggested that under such a regime, the NRA would and should make a song, the Second Amendment Blues, and get all of its members to vote to compensate the copyright owner in the Second Amendment Blues. And the result of all of these would be to distort the signals that creators obtain concerning what consumers value. All right, so despite its potential attractions, my suggestion is we don't use voting. Okay, so now, having counted relative popularity of entertainment products, you compensate creators in proportion to the frequency of consumptions. People whose works are popular get paid quite a bit. People whose works are not get paid less. Then you have to reform copyright law. So strict technically, you have to expand the list of exemptions, say now with the provision 107A, to authorize all of the activities that are currently illegal but engaged in with some frequency. Then there's a complicated issue I'd be happy to come back to. But what about DRM systems in this regime? So that's a sketch of how the model would work. Its advantages are considerable, but it also has some major disadvantages. Advantages. For consumers, huge cost savings. It would provide consumers unlimited access to entertainment. And therefore, as economists would say, eliminate deadweight loss. No one would get priced out of the market for entertainment because the market price for entertainment is now zero. There'd be no price discrimination in this regime. And cultural diversity and semiotic democracy, one of the primary potential benefits of the new technology, would be fully reaped. For artists, the advantage of this system, their incomes would be protected against the corrosion of peer-to-peer and other copying systems. They would be able under this model to distribute their work directly to consumers and therefore would not be dependent upon the record companies or their film studios as intermediaries. They would be able, for reasons I haven't dwelled on here, more freely to prepare derivative works, composites, expurgated versions, mashups of traditional works. They would, however, to the extent they are concerned with the integrity of their products, suffer injury on the moral rights dimension. The suppliers of the devices and services that would be taxed under the more likely of the two taxation model would be offset. The diminution in the demand for their products created by the new taxes would likely be offset by the increased value of the devices because of what they provide the consumers access to. And finally, the members of the public would enjoy decreased litigation costs and decreased encryption costs. So those are its benefits. Consumers, artists, suppliers, and the public. Here are its disadvantages. First, as I mentioned previously, such a system would give rise to cross-subsidies and distortions to the extent that the tax burden did not align precisely with the benefits of the regime. People who paid more proportionately in taxes than they benefited from entertainment would be disadvantaged, would feel it's unfair, and their behavior would be distorted accordingly. To repeat, everyone benefits, but some people benefit more than others. Next, this regime would necessarily confer upon an administrative agency, probably a reformed Copyright Office, substantial discretionary power, which is always hazardous. It's especially hazardous in an industry that has long been characterized by rent-seeking, pressure brought to bear by powerful intermediaries. Here, the record companies and the film studios, represented respectively by the RIAA and the MPAA, to extract inappropriately large returns. And finally, this system as I've described it thus far, instituted solely in the United States, would leak across national boundaries. French composers and performers whose works were recorded with the American Copyright Office would be paid through money collected from American taxpayers when American consumers listened to their songs. French consumers who gained access to songs prepared by American composers and performers would not pay. Now, is such a state of affairs unfair? Yes. Is it worse than our current situation? No. It's a practical matter, the same as the current regime. But its unfairness would reduce the political attractions of the system. Okay, so that's, as I say, a summary of the book as a whole with attention concentrated on the sixth approach. To repeat, it's the third, in my view, even taking into account its substantial hazards, most desirable of the schemes, but also, one has to acknowledge, the least likely to be adopted. Thank you. Okay, so we have up to, depending on your energy level, a half an hour for questions. For those of you who have other engagements, feel free. It's not rude to leave in the middle, but I'm happy to answer questions for as long as people want to.
Your talk, as you know, is very timely because even as we speak, it seems to be the case that everyone and his brother is offering new approaches to distributing music over the web. And I'm wondering, for example, Apple iTunes gives the consumer a song for 99 cents. Presumably there's some cost savings there. Why is that? Why is the market not a way? Why don't you think the market will eventually adjust to provide perhaps not the optimal solution, but the solutions that would not result in all of the savings going to the record companies or or in the case of in movies
Yeah. So the iTunes solution won't work under the current legal system because to make a group of consumers already accustomed to paying nothing for music buy it, they have to be either persuaded that it's wrong or frightened concerning the effects of engaging in this activity. Even individual lawsuits, if the only potential hazard is civil damages, are not going to be enough to persuade 60 million consumers to stop downloading, especially because since the individual lawsuits began a couple of months ago, we've seen an enormous jump in the popularity of Freenet, Earth Station 5, and other systems that disguise the identity of downloaders, effectively conceded by the record companies. So the popularity of this practice, the widespread commitment to its morality, I could talk about some survey data here, but the bottom line is most people who engage in this behavior don't think it's wrong, and the availability of systems that will enable them to continue to evade the legal rules means that against the backdrop of the current law and technology, iTunes won't be a solution to this problem. iTunes, Napster 2, and so forth. Now, that's not to say that Apple won't make money. It'll make a lot of money because there's a significant group of people who are either persuaded that copyright is morally justified or in professional positions for which it would be very embarrassing to be prosecuted, and they'll buy the iTunes songs at 99 cents a pop or $10 per CD, despite the fact that they are draped with digital rights management systems that make them less portable than the stuff available through Kazaa Lite. So iTunes will make money, but it won't prevent the music industry from collapsing. Okay, that's the first level answer. Now here's the second level answer. You could, however, intensify the penalties for engaging in this unlawful activity and make the market work. And that's basically the strategy of Chapter 4 here, is ramping up the prohibitions. So more specifically, if you lowered the willfulness requirement and enhanced criminal penalties for engaging in this activity, or you permitted self-help, like spoofing, interdiction, encryption. Interdiction is the system that the record companies and movie studios are just beginning in a worried posture to experiment with. It's basically distributed denial of service attacks on consumers making music available on peer-to-peer networks. So if I find that you have a copy of Madonna on your hard drive, making it a recent Madonna release, making it available to the world, I, a representative or agent of the record company, request the copy of this song continuously and freeze your internet connection. That's interdiction. They haven't used it very enthusiastically yet because they're afraid it's a violation of the Consumer Fraud and Abuse Act and might subject them to criminal penalties. They're worried about what the federal prosecutors are going to do. But a little adjustment in the relevant statute, combined with a little adjustment in the practices of the Justice Department vis-a-vis criminal copyright violation, amplified, if we wanted to go all the way, by the Consumer Broadband and Digital Television Promotion Act, which would bury in each computer a device that would recognize copyright protection signals and respect it. Those things would make a market possible. Against the backdrop of enhanced protections, the market would indeed work. And you'd get all the benefits of a market, including refined pricing system. Now, I mentioned, however, that there's some disadvantages of going down this road. This is, to repeat, the most likely course. This is where things are likely to go. But it's unfortunate for a variety of reasons. Those are the reasons. Now, here's one I didn't mention that's provoked by your question. Well, don't you reap all of the cost savings in this approach? No, you don't. You miss two big potential advantages of the new technology. First is you preserve the disadvantages of any intellectual property regime, which is deadweight loss because people get priced out of the market, completely unnecessarily. That's one thing you miss. The other thing you miss is to run a market against this backdrop requires micropayments that you have to account for each time Jamie downloads a piece of music. And those will get more and more fluid over time, but you'll never eliminate them. That's one of the reasons, not the only reason, why an iTunes song costs 99 cents. A significant portion of that goes to the credit card company. That's friction, a significant amount of friction that's unavoidable in this regime, and that would be avoided in an alternative compensation system. James?
So, wonderful presentation, beautifully timed, an entire book in an hour. It was fabulous. And I think this kind of enterprise really clarifies both the strengths and weaknesses of the current system. So if all you did was this would be a huge success. But there's no Chapter 7 in which you apply the careful, classically Fisherian analysis to a different marketplace, namely the marketplace for intellectual property legislation, and reflect on the likely consequences of this proposal being introduced in the current configuration of players. What would happen to it, who would like it, who would dislike it, how they would do it. Now, you talk as you go along about who would benefit, and those are proxies clearly for what people might do if we assume people are self-interested, consumer benefits, everything. Certainly, I think anyone who listened to this would go, wow, for $5 I get unlimited entertainment and I don't have to deal with any of the hassle of this. That's great, sign me up. And that, it seems to me, is the most likely source of this actually being adopted, this sort of populist thing where you go door to door or perhaps barnstorm across America and build a movement to support this. But what I'm interested in is what you think, who you think in terms of the powerful current players in the current market for IP policy, both nationally and because this will, as you note in the book, require an amendment of the WIPO Treaty, internationally, would buy into this, who would not buy into it, and how the people who are currently in there, who have interests that you note in the chapter, although not as much in your presentation, would be severely hurt by this, such as the intermediaries, would attempt to sabotage it, rationally perceive it, because you tell them that it will be in their long-term disadvantage, and what bits of it they might try to keep, such that, since we already have in Europe situations where we have taxes on things like videotapes and so forth, layered on top of an already strong copyright system and moral rights system. So you might have all of the above. So you have all the disadvantages of the strong property rights system, plus taxes on CDs, taxes on download systems, and the record company goes, now that part of his analysis I like, the revenue stream part. That was after that it got kind of boring. But the revenue stream part was really interesting. So what would Chapter 7 say about all of that?
Well, it's a good, complicated question. So I've presented versions of this argument in many different settings over the last 6 months, roughly. And just simplifying a bit, I could give you examples, but simplifying a bit, here's how the different players lay out. Most consumers like it a lot. There's a small group, as we have briefly discussed earlier, who regard access to entertainment for free, I mean truly for free, as a right now, and so object to any system that would cost them anything. But it's a small group. Most consumers like this a lot. On the other side, most creators like this a lot. Certainly all sort of mid-level creators, like the musicians associated with the Future of Music Coalition, when I presented it there, like the idea a good deal. Now, here, however, there is a significant subset of creators who are not so enthusiastic because they benefit from the extreme distribution inequality in the current regime. They are the stars promoted by the record companies. They are the star directors. They make a lot of money, and they'd make less under this system. Why do they make less? Well, because if you're holding constant the revenues of the industry, you're generating much greater diversity. Where does that money come from? It comes from the people on the very top are coming down. All right, so they're not so enthusiastic. That's something definitely to be worried about in terms of political viability. With those two exceptions, consumers like it, artists like it. The manufacturers and distributors of machinery, laptops, broadband access, and so forth, okay with this. Not, jumping on the bandwagon, but they're pretty much okay with it. Like Les Fedez from Intel, for example, the Verizon folks. Partly because they fear the Consumer Broadband Digital Television Protection Act. They fear lockdown of their technology by Congress in order to protect the interests of the copyright owners, which will make their devices less valuable, much less flexible, whereas a system of this sort would avoid that hazard. So they're all right with it. The two groups that are opposed, at least in the representatives of them almost without exception that have thus far been opposed, are first, copyright lawyers. Now, our copyright lawyers are unhappy for an obvious reason, is they get less business in this regime. Litigation, what happens when litigation costs go way down? So there's less litigation. But also they regret the loss in elegance. Now, those of us who teach copyright law, you say elegant, and it's built through a series of legislative compromises. But there's a certain nostalgia by the professoriate for copyright law, and especially by practitioners. That's a more worrisome lobby than you might think. Okay, and then last but not least, as you suggest, the principal intermediaries, the record companies and the movie studios, each of whom I've presented this argument to, and each of whom have been firm in their opposition. Now, when you ask the market for statutory change, the way that the copyright law gets modified in the United States is if and only if all of the relevant interest groups line up in support of an initiative, do you see a change? That's the way the 76 Act happened, as Jessica Littman has showed in detail. That's the way the Digital Millennium Copyright Act happened. So it's hopeless to get such a system adopted without getting at least a significant sector of the record industry and the film studios to sign on. Chances of that are small, but they're not insignificant. Two things in combination might conceivably do it. One is their fortunes continue to plummet. As things get worse and worse, feeling desperation may push them. The second is persuasion. I still have a naive faith that I can show them the world would be better. You have a question?
Yeah, there seems to me, I'm actually in favor of your proposals. Let me be a little bit of a devil's advocate. There are two things that strike me as salient that you haven't fleshed out. One is, as you say, you're going to go from a scheme having a traditional bell curve of payments to one that's more flattened out. You're getting rid of price discrimination. I'm not sure why you assume that's per se a good. I can see why it's good for those who don't get much money now. It's bad for those who make a lot of money now. But the second thing is that I also took in your point about price discrimination and more generally that you were worried about the record companies capturing too much of the value. And I asked the second question, I truly don't understand this. I don't quite understand why it is they have been able to capture so much value. You know, artists are always complaining about how much record companies are taking. Why is that? I think about the rise of blogs and arts and letters dailies and other editorial sources for words, where people are just putting up their own words, and I'll have those editors. And yet we don't have the same thing for music. And what I wonder is whether or not, frankly, the dirty little secret that most record companies know is that one boy band is fungible with another boy band, and so the one they promote is one that people will sort of go with and be happy with, in a way that wouldn't be the same case for written argument. Right? It wouldn't work the same way for Arts and Letters Daily couldn't start giving me bad articles to read, and I would happily go back. And so, in fact, the reason that the record companies are so successful is because they actually are performing what turns out to be an editorial function that consumers value. There's 1,000 boy bands. Just tell me which is the one that everybody's going to be listening to, so I can be in and listening to. I know they're all fungible, right? There's the cute one and the one who's got the drinking problem or whatever. Just pick the one, and then I'll go with it. So the second question is, what is the value created by those music companies? Because I can't understand why they have been able to have such a dominant role, had those contracts so beneficial to them, such that you really believe, I think accurately, that they would capture a lot of the surplus if we had a perfect property rights system in Chapter 4.
Phew. Okay. Well, see, there are two different distribution things that will be affected here. The distribution of incomes of artists in both certainly the music industry is a little more complicated than the film industry is not a bell curve. It's like this, and it's like skew log normal is the distribution, and so Madonna is over here, and all the future music people, a very large number of them, are over here making not enough money to survive on waiting tables, and the distribution in the new regime would be more like this. So your first question, well, why is that a good thing? Well, there's a long argument in Chapter 2 about this, but basically this behavior produces all sorts of distortions in the market that are associated, broadly speaking, with the tradition of winner takes all, in which the first step in the argument is diminishing marginal utility of wealth. The benefit to these folks of having so much put in their pockets is much less than the disadvantage of these folks of getting so little. It also, this structure draws an excessive number of people into the market who overestimate their chances of hitting the jackpot. So you get rent dissipation with an excessive crowding who don't actually hit the jackpot, who then drive these numbers up. So both from a cultural and economic standpoint, this is a bad distribution, and this one is better. All right, that's the first issue. The second issue is price discrimination. Why is price discrimination why is the absence of price discrimination in the alternative compensation system better than the presence of price discrimination in the market-based regime? Right, so this is, let's do this really, how to do this crisply. Compared to the current forms of price discrimination in the, we'll take the music industry. No, take the film industry. The refined price discrimination made possible by this fancy new market would be better. Why? Because the current price discrimination in the film industry is temporal price discrimination, which is clumsy, second-degree price discrimination in which you offer consumers different versions of the same good. In this case, one today, one in a year in VHS format, one in 2 years on network television and so forth, solely for the purposes of forcing consumers to sort themselves out. And there's just social waste in doing that. So what we rely on now, because the structural copyright law and the weakness of technology is clumsy second-degree price discrimination. In this new environment, with much more refined pricing and much better data about consumers' tastes, we don't rely on that. We rely on third degree. We know what you care about, and we sell you music on the basis of your ability and willingness to pay for it, and the next time you buy a plane ticket to Paris, all of your CD prices go up by $1. Now, that's refined, highly profitable from the record company's standpoint. It avoids the social losses associated with second degree. And now here we get a little more tricky. This is still on the plus side. It's progressive. It takes from the rich and gives to the poor and makes entertainment more widely available. All those things seem to be advantageous. However, it has an accompanying set of cultural disadvantages. It makes the culture at large granular, makes it feel like every bit of information and entertainment you get is affecting your ability to buy and get other information, which is true in this environment. It also will conduce to invasions of privacy and efforts to avoid invasions of privacy. So the next time you go to the grocery store, you're going to do like the professors at Stanford Law School do. You're going to form a little club in Duke in which you all have discount cards for Star Market, whatever your grocery store is here. And once a week you rotate so as to confuse the signals that the grocery stores are getting about what your preferences are. So there will be efforts to invade your privacy and resistance. So these things together, granularity and the privacy problems, in my view, are enough to dramatically complicate considerably the potential benefits of price discrimination in the market system. Against that backdrop, however, the alternative compensation system is much better. It doesn't have any price discrimination. The price for the product is its marginal cost, which is 0. Price discrimination at its best approximates a world in which people gain access to entertainment at marginal costs, whereas the alternative compensation system reaches it. All right, third question is, why are they able to aggregate the money? And they are. Simple example. When you move from shellac records to long play vinyl records to CDs, the record companies preserved in their contracts this thing called breakage. What is breakage? Breakage is there's a deduction for the percentage of shellac records that broke. Well, LPs didn't break very much, and CDs don't break at all, but the term just continues through the contracts. So why didn't competition force this premium out? Okay, well, the simple answer is it's an oligopoly. There are only 5 companies, and they have tacit practices. Their lawyers share information. Okay, but that's not a full solution, because why can't people just go around them? And okay, so now it's a clever interlocking effect in which there are big economies of scale in the distribution networks in the music industry. That's where the power is. That's why all the little indies associate themselves with the big record companies, is because your ability to have a system, it's why there's only a few FedExes and Big Brown, UPS. It's because distribution networks are really expensive. That's where the power is. And so relatively few record companies are able to support distribution networks. That's how their market share increases. And there's no effective business model yet for distributing directly to consumers without running through those distribution channels. So unlike the news, which is commonly distributed in blog space now. The semiotic democracy is happening there. Why is it commonly distributed? Because people don't have to charge money for it. They do it on a voluntary basis. No problem. But if you're a musician and you're not independently wealthy or you don't make enough money in your performances, you want to collect some money. And there's no business model right now. The tip jar system didn't work. There's no business model to enable you to make money through this end run mechanism. So you're forced into the hands of the record companies. That's how they do it. And then they have very supplementary things to lock in. Payola, Clear Channel, Dominating Your Taste. So actually you don't know of boy bands other than the 2 or 3 that you hear as you drive in and out to work. Those are all supplementary systems that lock it in. The market system, the Chapter 4 approach, will enhance this effect. The alternative compensation system would eliminate it, which is why the record companies rightly hate the idea. Yeah.
I'm not sure if I can articulate this exactly how I want to, but there seems to be an implicit assumption that removing barriers to entry is a good thing. And I'm not sure that barriers to entry don't serve a useful purpose in that you can keep out, in I don't know how subjectively or objectively I can say this, but you can keep out the garbage. And when you let in a lot of garbage, when there's a lower barrier to entry, it seems like you're going to reduce quality across the board. And I wonder if you address this at all. You know, you seem to be coming at it from all the economic advantages and so forth, but what about from the quality aspect? Are we going to be as entertained under your system?
Yeah. Well, here's a relatively medium-scale response, and then I'll try for the harder issue. The medium-scale response is that just because there's more productivity of entertainment in this environment doesn't mean that that's what everybody will consume. You don't have to just open your mouth and ingest whatever's flowing to you over the system. You would, in this environment, rely upon sifters and aggregators, just like you do now. Just there'd be a lot more of them, leaner, more specialized enterprises. Whereas now it's the record companies or the major film studios that determine what's available to you. In this new environment, there'd be a whole bunch of other ones. So an example, if you go to, return to the example I mentioned earlier, live365.com, which is an aggregator of non-interactive webcasts, thousands of them. Well, you don't have to just go and listen to whatever's there. Instead, each one has a description, and each one has associated with it a rating system, which is based on a basic sort of eBay model of a number of stars, depending on what listeners thought of it. So people are expressing choices about what's good and what's bad, which puts competitive pressure on the webcasters to offer good stuff, not bad stuff. So you would see, both in the music environment and in the film environment, lots of sifters who'd be offering you guides and guides much more closely associated with your tastes than is possible when there are relatively few aggregators, ABC, CBS, Warner Brothers, and so forth. Okay, that, as I say, is a medium-level response, partial response to your question. But it remains an issue. Okay, but still, if we cut out this, in the music industry, there may be no cost in terms of loss of quality, because where all this income currently goes is to Britney Spears mansions. But in the movie industry, there may be a cost, an effect on actually the entertainment that's produced. You may not get Titanic in this environment because, Titanic is, what, $100 million to produce? You will get fewer extravaganzas in the film industry. And you'll get more sex, lies, and videotape. Low-budget films. That's true. It'll change the character of entertainment. Now, there's an argument, it's discussed in Chapter 2 of the book, about why, on balance, that's a good thing, and that the extravaganza in the film industry and the corresponding homogenization of plots, genre, expectations is bad. And fewer Titanics would be culturally advantageous. But that's definitely a controversial judgment, and your view could well differ on this score.
You mentioned that there might be concerns with the fact that the government is essentially establishing this flow of money, is deciding how much money is going to be collected, the overall size that's going to be given to artists, and even make decisions about which genres or types will get certain levels of money. I wonder if you could address a little more, not the question of rent seeking, but the question of kind of political problems. With the NEA, there's a lot of political outcry over what money goes to what kinds of artists. I would think the problem would be compounded by the fact that Congress would not only have to make decisions about who gets money, some of it which would be unpopular, but if the size of the pot is large enough, it's inevitably going to be raided by Congress looking for money whenever the budget is tight, as opposed to the NEA, which is so small, it essentially kind of escapes scrutiny most of the time.
Yeah. Well, as to the first half of your question, I may have left a misimpression if I suggested that any government administrator would be determining the relative amounts of money that goes to, say, jazz versus classical versus rock. That's not part of the system. That's all done on the basis of consumer sovereignty. If jazz remains only 3 to 4% of the market in music, it's only going to get 3 to 4% of the revenues from such a system. Straight consumer demand. But you're right that there are other points in which there are exercises of discretion, and the most important of them is the aggregate size of the pie that the agency has to adjust over time and increase or decrease tax rates accordingly. That will be undoubtedly controversial, especially if, as in the NEA context, some of the stuff getting funded is sexual in character or politically controversial in character. That's true. And so that's one of the reasons why the income tax, which is the way the NEA is funded, would be especially controversial and difficult to get through. Now, in your last issue, most people that I've talked to in the United States are not especially worried about the hijacking of the revenue stream for, the war in Iraq. People, even those with considerable skepticism concerning the decency of the American government, don't think that a tax designated in legislation to go for entertainment would be diverted. You may be one who disagrees, but actually when I present this issue in developing countries like Brazil, everybody thinks that. An income tax is a hopeless idea because the government will just take it all and use it for whatever.
Continue this at the reception, or you want to take one more question?
I'll take one more question from David, and then I'd be happy to hang out for the reception.
Could we go back to your Titanic and discussion for a minute and talk about that? I agree with you completely about what would happen in terms of Titanic. We would have fewer Titanics and we would have also fewer water wars. No more. But why is this not also true? If we do nothing voluntary and we simply leave things as they are, we don't really try to improve the system, we don't ramp up copyright, we just let the industries subside into their dinosaur graves. Is it not true that in the aftermath of that kind of subsidence, we would have the same outcome that you posit? By virtue of the interposition of your third paradigm, we will get more small films. We will have them made by lots of people like Stephen, not Stephen Steele. Who the hell is it I want? Yeah, so those are the kinds of films we'll get, and they'll play in little theaters like Chelsea, and we'll probably have some new systems for exhibition in which we have digital exhibition and maybe rolling trailers, and we will maybe watch more stuff at home and not be so consistent. How is it that we won't have, I'm not talking about the music business, because I know less about it and frankly care less about it. Where the movie business is concerned, we're going to end up there if we do nothing, right? And it will be a more satisfying thing. And fraught with none of the hazards. I don't mind all the hazards. I mean, rank them roughly between chicken and rock climbing, but let's talk about doing nothing. Won't we get where we want to be?
So here are a couple of responses. It's possible, but here would be two worries I'd have about that scenario. First one is, as the frequency with which people get a hold of perfect copies of first-run movies before they're even released in theaters and make them available on the internet goes up, and as the quality, attractiveness of large, full-size, flat-panel screens and home video systems increases, I think that the death of the dinosaurs might be the death of movies for a significant period of time, because even the small-scale folks are not going to be able to make money in this area if people don't go to theaters anymore, if they get their stuff, let me finish, if they get their stuff through the internet for free, play it at home for themselves and their friends. That may not be enough revenue to support any kind of industry. All right, that's the first and less serious of my worries. Here's the more serious of my worries. The dinosaurs are not going to go quietly into their graves. They will push for protection. And it's an amazing thing, actually, that an industry, the music industry, is a $13 billion industry. $13 billion sounds like a lot of money. It's a tiny industry that has extraordinary political clout, and the movie industry even more so. They will not go quietly. So the idea that we'll just leave things alone, it will collapse, and then little films will rise like little phoenixes from the ashes. No, we will get the Consumer Broadband and Digital Television Protection Act, broadcast flag legislation, all sorts of other things that will be substantially worse than the scenario you describe, unless we try to imagine and persuade people of the merits of an alternative future. Thank you.
Thank you, Kevin.